So again, no real introduction necessary because I mentioned Slava's wonderful achievements and his book about Subaltern Empire yesterday. And today he's going to speak to us about Postcolonial Unevenness, thinking and writing about Imperial Legacies.
Okay, do I need a microphone, or I can probably use it just in case. Okay, good morning. I will have to wear glasses because I don't see my own slides from here. The idea for today is to continue more or less where we finished yesterday and talk about how unevenness and hierarchies and legacies work in the actual practice, and also maybe have a discussion. I didn't prepare anything specifically about writing because I think it's something that we could discuss together. But at least in terms of thinking, I have a few. I don't know whether I should call them tips or simply warnings or simply criticisms, because I'm sure that all of you are very knowledgeable and sensible people, and you do not commit mistakes that the authors I will be discussing commit. But what I wanted to draw your attention to are certain stereotypes which are very deeply entrenched in both Western and Russian academic discourses, not just journalistic and societal discourses, such as, to give you a heads up, Homo Sovieticus paradigm, one of my favorite objects of criticism. Fortunately, it has been criticized widely in the recent years, but this is just one example of how the unevenness and hierarchies that are in their origin colonialist and imperialist, how they work in today's reality, how they shape our thinking, how they shape our writing, and how eventually something that we have to free ourselves from, and something that we have to critically reassess. But it's also a great source. It's also a great symptom of what I would call the post-colonial condition. And it's a great illustration of how imperial legacies work in the actual practice. So let's start with where we more or less finished last time. Just to remind you, we're dealing with situations of displacement, indeed, where then, for the reason that indeed, because of the injustices committed by colonialism or during the time of colonialism, because of the displacement, there is a search for rootedness, there is a search for authenticity, and as I said at the end of my yesterday's lecture, it can go two ways. It can go towards sort of backwards, towards indigeneity, towards pre-colonial authenticity, which is, of course, unrecoverable. It's been lost forever. It can only be invented, reinvented, reconstructed, and so on. Or it can go, and this is more East European way rather than let's say, classical colonial way, but it can go towards civilization, identifying our authenticity with civilization. And this is where you have the paradigm of kidnapping of Europe or rape of Europe, an old trope which is being reenacted in today's reality via the idea that Russia, in particular, but maybe also other colonial empires have hijacked, kidnapped Eastern European modernity. They took East European countries away from their predestined path towards Europeanness, or together with the rest of Europe, and took them somewhere in a wrong direction, and now the task is to return to civilization. And it's interesting that in Russia both paradigms work. I mean, actually, both work also in Eastern Europe, but as of now, I would say that the civilization paradigm, the pro-European paradigm, is stronger in Eastern Europe. There are nativist movements, especially caused by the resentment or resistance to European Union. But nevertheless, the mainstream is still pro-European, whereas in Russia, the mainstream currently is definitely, well, I don't know what is mainstream in Russia, but let's say the official discourse is definitely nativist and even a caricature of nativism in a certain sense, and nativism on steroids, if you want to put it this way. Some of the examples that I would like to talk about, and some of them I'm planning to discuss in more detail, but we can also talk about others. I already mentioned this occupation paradigm yesterday. Again, the idea that European countries were occupied rather than colonized. There is indeed very strong resistance in some circles, in the Baltic states, for instance, to the colonization paradigm. Although there are people like Epp Annus, for instance, or Piret Peiker and others who are very strongly, who have invested a lot into treating the Baltic case as a post-colonial case, so that discourse is also developing, but the mainstream would still argue that East European countries have been occupied rather than colonized, and this, as I said, has provoked this question from a provocative question from Nancy Condi: how white one must be to be occupied? The same concerns expats and relocants, relocanti, as opposed to migrants. But of course, there are multiple other examples that come to mind when we discuss these hierarchies, eventually coming from the imperial period. The strong racialization of the Russian troops fighting in Ukraine, connected to some extent with the fact that indeed disproportionately these troops have been recruited from some of the ethnic regions. There are different patterns there. Again, I'm sure that you know at least something about this, but we know that there are quite a few people from Buryatia, proportionally speaking. And then there is a different story with the Chechen troops and their involvement. Kadyrov's TikTok army and maybe not so TikTok. We don't know how much they're actually involved in the battlefield, but there are strong suspicions that they are mostly producing video materials rather than actually fighting. We don't know the proportion here again. And as I said, these are different stories, and we should, of course, also be aware of the fact that many of Russia's ethnic territories are relatively poorer than mainland Russia. So this is something that strongly determines the likelihood of people being either simply agreeing to get mobilized or even volunteering to serve in the army. But regardless of the actual ethnic composition of the troops on the ground, there is a strong tendency to describe the entire Russian military in Ukraine as Asiati, Orki, and so on and so forth. So there is this language which is extremely derogatory, and it's used. Of course, it's understandable that it's used by Ukrainians, but it then filters into the mainstream European discourse and becomes almost the norm. I would also connect this with the moral panic about the alleged overwhelming support for the war in Russia. Again, this is an endless debate. We can discuss this as well if you want. But let me just say that I'm, of course, here with such people as Greg Yudin and others who have, for years, very strongly criticized opinion polls and the entire industry of surveys, especially in Russia, but also more generally as a methodological paradigm. And I also believe that opinion polls do not tell us much. They tell us something, but they definitely do not tell us anything about the support for the war. For one, I think the main reason is not even the polls as such. It's the concept of support. I mean, what do you mean when you say support the war, right? If you ask directly, it's one thing. If you look at what people do, it's a completely different story. Most people do nothing, and that can qualify as some form of support, but it's definitely not active support that is being ascribed to these people. But what is interesting in this context is the moral panic that exists in the Russian liberal anti-war, part of the Russian liberal anti-war spectrum, and then of course in the global debate about the situation in Russia. And this leads to very heated and extremely aggressive debates and discussions and attacks on each other within the Russian anti-war community, which are, of course, extremely counterproductive, but I don't know to what extent this is inevitable. But I think in the final analysis, as I will try to show a little later, this is connected with the legacies of Russian subaltern imperialism and with Homo Sovieticus, the paradigm of Homo Sovieticus. And another illustration that I'm probably going to talk in detail about is it's an old story, but I think it's still valid. It's still there. And it illustrates the significance of both class and race, something that I highlighted also yesterday, and I would like to illustrate it today with especially this example, race and class, the significance of both race and class, and how central whiteness and something that I would call aristocratic self-identity of Russian liberalism that plays out in nearly all of these stories. I mean, if you look at all of these examples that you see in this slide, they are connected with both race and class. And it's not just Russia. Again, something that I'm going to illustrate. I mean, I'm a Russianist, so I have to focus on Russia. This is the material I know best. But I will try to refer you to some other people's work on other countries, in particular Poland, which is a fascinating case in that regard, where this also works. So let's first maybe go here. Movement for Black Lives. Oh. That's something that I picked from my colleagues, some of whom are actually black, like black Americans, who prefer to call it M4BL rather than BLM, because BLM is just a slogan, whereas Movement for Black Lives is a kind of more generic designation. So I guess this is a good point to start, because this is, I'm sure, familiar to most of you, and Georgi was even here lecturing in the framework of this school. So you have structural accounts of unevenness which already establish a certain valuable ground for the analysis of the landscape that we are trying to navigate in our analysis of Russian post-imperial space. It's, of course, the concept of peripherality and semi-peripherality, which is, I think, central. It's also central to my analysis. I mean, I simply take it, adopt it from world system theory, Wallerstein, Derogyan, Kagarlitsky as well, his book on the Empire of the Periphery. I think it's a very useful analysis of Russian history. Might be a little bit biased, and the evidence might be somewhat selectively processed, but nevertheless, I think it's a very useful account of Russian history from a world systemic perspective. The paradigm of uneven and combined development, coming from Trotsky, of course, but Justin Rosenberg has done great work on establishing unevenness and combination as key categories in international relations more generally. And actually, his argument is that international relations as such, as a domain of the social, is characterized by fundamental multiplicity, and this is what defines international relations as a perspective, as opposed to political science, sociology, and so on. And multiplicity as a fundamental condition, which then leads to unevenness, because basically, when you have multiplicity and some form of development, not necessarily teleological, but simply development in the sense of change, then you will probably inevitably have unevenness, because there will be hierarchies, situational hierarchies, and it doesn't have to be connected with modernization theory, right? You don't have to believe that there is an endpoint towards which everything develops. You just have to accept the fact that development itself creates unevenness, and this is an important point, I think. Resource dependence, rents, this explains a lot, including in the current war. Obviously, the fact that Russia has been able to mobilize enormous resources for its war effort matters a lot. And Atkins' analysis in his most recent book is very pertinent here, but also Vladimir Gelman's bad governance. I mean, it's not about rents per se, but the idea that institutions matter is key here, and I think this book was, in many respects, it sort of foresaw the outcomes. Of course, no one was able or had been able to actually predict what was going to happen, but with hindsight, this analysis seems to be important. So the fact that institutions in Russia have been shaped by resource dependence, by rent-seeking, by attempts to mobilize, extract resources, and transport them and sell them on the global markets. This is all extremely important. So the basic idea here is that capitalism is a universal system, but different societies join under different conditions, and therefore Russia has been not uniquely, but structurally placed as a resource empire, as a country that, or a state in particular, a state that has been shaped by this paradigm of resource processing. Now, what I would say, and I'm a post-structuralist, so obviously I very much appreciate structuralist accounts, and not all of them are structuralist. I mean, I would probably not call Gelman a structuralist in the proper sense of the word, but institutionalism connected with idea of rent-seeking becomes a structuralist account. But I think identity matters here. Identity and discourse are also important, this is where the idea of Subaltern Empire comes from. It's, by the way, I should have put it in the slide that the term itself belongs, of course, to Madina Tlostanova, one of the key decolonial thinkers. And decolonial approach is, of course, rather different from postcolonialism. So let's not go into that. But Madina coined it in one of her articles back, I think, in 2008, if not earlier. And I simply picked it up and tried to develop it along these lines, along more structuralist lines, let's say. I also accept Alexander Etkin's idea of internal colonization with certain caveats. Indeed, I agree that the ethnic Russian periphery was also colonized, and there was, for a while, for a very important, for the formative period in the Russian history, and especially in the Russian sort of public culture or discursive space. There was this period when there was a cultural gap between the elites and the masses. And this cultural gap was indeed very important for the emergence of Russia as a subaltern empire. And this is where, these are the limits within which the internal colonization paradigm, I think, works. You should not universalize it beyond its own limits. And also the emphasis on internal is problematic for many people. Of course, East Europeans in particular have, people like Eva Thompson and others have criticized Atkins fiercely for using the term internal, because they say, what is internal about colonization of Siberia? Do you really believe that Siberia belonged to Russia before colonization, right? So that's the point here. Or Ukraine. Was Ukraine internal to Muscovy? But of course, again, with Ukraine, it's more problematic because it's definitely not a typical case of colonization. But for me, what is missing in these debates is, or rather the problem with these debates is that they still remain within the paradigm of what Justin Rosenberg calls internalism, meaning that everything happens within national boxes. You have Russia, regardless of whether it's just Muscovy or the Russian Empire, but then you still see it as a certain space within which everything happens. And then this space has relations with the outside world. And this is something that I don't buy. And I think Justin's project, Justin Rosenberg's project in that regard is very important, because he's writing a book right now about a book which is a critique of internalism, what he calls internalism. You may also call it methodological nationalism, a more familiar term perhaps, but it's actually wider than that, because it stretches back into times before nationalism becomes dominant. So what I argue in my book in particular is that Russia indeed colonized itself, in as much as we can call it self or whatever, but the key point is that this colonization happened on behalf of the global capitalist core. So the Russian state actually acted as an agent of external forces in that regard. And the degree to which you may call them external depends on your point of view. If you want to emphasize Russian space per se, it's one thing. If you want to emphasize the global dimension, then it's not external. Then it's simply that the Russian elites were part of the global cosmopolitan European elites, and they were acting as part, maybe a special part, of this global core, in that sense. From very early on, this colonization happened in search of resources, definitely. It was driven by rent-seeking, by attempts to mobilize resources. And of course, before oil, it was grain for a while, and hence the importance of serfdom. And before grain, it was, these were other resources such as, well, Etkin emphasizes fur in particular, at the early stage in particular. I have seen criticisms of that, which argue that furs constitute a marginal share in what you may call the national income or GDP or whatever. I mean, again, an anachronism, obviously, but for lack of a better concepts. But I think what is missing in such assessments is, of course, the relative importance of relatively small sectors, which might be small in terms of their share in the economy, but might have formative significance for instance, imperial expansion. So again, I'm not trying to judge here. I haven't done my own research on that, but I think that the argument is still still might be valid. Anyway, what is important here to my mind is the fact that this colonization was part of a global process, and it was definitely driven not by certain internal impulses belonging to the internal space of Russia, however we define it, culture, economy, anything. But it was part of a global project and part of a global colonial expansion of Europe, a part of the European colonial expansion, an organic part. And then the next important step is, and this brings us to Homo Sovieticus and other phenomena that I mentioned in the beginning, is that Russian elites have always been positioned in the interstice between Europe and the people. And Europe in this sense means civilization in the singular, the only civilization, the real civilization, the space of certain universal truth, and the people as the domain of the particular, of culture, of what signifies this romantic idea or romanticist idea of organic nationhood and multiplicity of cultures, civilizations, and so on. This brings us to the debate between the Westernizers and the Slavophiles, which of course comes from this conflict between, on the one hand, identification with Europe and civilization, and on the other hand, identification with one's own people. Who are different, but who are in this romanticist discourse coming from, of course, again, the Germans are to blame here, from the romanticist idea of nationhood, multiplicity of nations, multiplicity of national culture, and the value, the universal value of belonging to one's own particular nation. Right? So a certain universalization of particularism. You become a member of humanity by belonging to your own nation. You partake in the universal by belonging to something particular. And this is the only way you can partake in the universal within this paradigm. In the case of the Russian elites, the nobility first, then intelligentsia, which picks it up, develops it, fights within itself through the 19th century, then through the revolution. It becomes a very important topic, of course, also in the Marxist debates. And then coming to the late Soviet period, this becomes central again. And it's, in a certain sense, you have a replay of the 19th century in the late Soviet public culture, with the debates about nationhood, socialist in, what was it, national informed socialist in content, right? The culture, the national motives in the Soviet culture, how, in Armenia, by the way, it was extremely important. In architecture, for instance, you see it even today in Yerevan, how they use universal forms and then add national elements to it, and it becomes, yes, something that was tolerated and even promoted by the Communist Party, so in a sense, yes, it's a replay of the same debates, but. The result is that you have, in the case of the Russian elites and Russian society maybe as a whole, you have a deeply split, ambivalent identity which looks both ways. And the cycles of Russian history are, at least to some extent, explained by this. It's of course also Trotsky's whip of external necessity, the geopolitical pressure that Russia and other peripheral countries come under, and this is one of the reasons why they have to catch up eventually. They cannot stay isolated, because if they stay isolated, they fall behind. They become victims of imperialist struggles. They become colonized and conquered. At least in Trotsky's time, this was definitely the case. Today, it might be slightly different, but still valid, I think. I mean, look at Russia once again. Self-inflicted, but to some extent, this logic is still there. But it's also about identity, and it's not unique, of course, to Russia. Look at Turkey, look at Hungary, look at Poland, many other cases, and you can even stretch it a little bit and bring it all the way to Trump and white working class identity in the U.S. But that's a stretch, and we can talk about this in Q&A maybe. So. You have this ambivalence. You have this split, constitutive split that determines Russia's, I would say, the entire development, because it also.
Why not?
Why not? Yes, it's also about, again, it's also about economic peripherality, obviously, about technological backwardness, and I mean, I'm using this term consciously because indeed, especially in late capitalism, technological lagging behind in technological terms becomes backwardness. It becomes, literally in Trotsky's terms, it makes you backward, it makes you vulnerable, it makes you dependent on the core. And we see it today again in Russia with the sanctions and how they affect the economy, and the long-term effects are still, of course, ahead of us. We'll still maybe have a chance to observe them, but anyway, this already illustrates how dependent Russia is on imported technologies, and the fact that they had to allegedly import washing machines to produce missiles is illustrated here. So this is the argument in a nutshell, but I would also argue, and this is something that I don't feel quite comfortable because I don't know the empirical material that well, but I think it has been transferred to the colonized nations. Also in the process of nation building itself, especially during the Soviet time, and more generally modernization and so on. But there's definitely this two-tier hierarchy with Russia as a Subaltern Empire, sometimes symbolizing civilization, sometimes symbolizing the opposite of civilization. But the idea of civilization and the idea that there is only one civilization and that you have to develop in that direction, which is indicated by Europe and sometimes Russia as the representative of Europe, is definitely there. And then also as an alternative, you can also you can try to invent your pre-colonial modernity and say, let's go back there. So I would say that the scheme becomes more like this, maybe, where you have some authenticity before colonization. Well, again, authenticity only in the sense that it's something that was relatively independent. And again, I'm not arguing. I'm not presenting any golden age here, right? Any golden age myth. I'm simply saying that yes, indeed, human cultures before capitalism were probably more self-sufficient, not necessarily in economic terms or. I'm not denying the importance of exchange, something that Georgi emphasizes a lot in his recent work. But not just Georgi. Again, the book by Graeber and Van Gogh would be a good illustration here. The movement of people, for instance, across North American continent was something that was ordinary in the pre-colonial time, despite different languages, despite very different modes of production, societal structures, and so on. People were able to move relatively freely within that space, at least according to the evidence that we have. So this does not deny interconnectedness, but at the same time it does posit a certain pre-colonial sense of selfhood, which was maybe which was based, each of such identities was based on its own hierarchies, which normally put that society in the center, and then everyone around them were others against whom you define your identity as usual. But with empire comes a very unipolar or unilateral, unidirectional, unidimensional hierarchical structure in which you have only one civilization. Everyone is moving towards that civilization. Some peoples are backward, some cultures are backward, some cultures are more advanced, and so on. This produces a lot of displacement. Again, not that displacement hadn't happened before, but this becomes a global and maybe very large-scale displacement in that sense. And then from there, you can either go back to indigeneity or to civilization in this effort of decolonization. And this is where you have either the third world paradigm, where then you criticize Europe and the US and of liberalism for imposing one model on everyone, or you try to imagine your authenticity as connected with civilization and claim that you belong to the first world. And this is the Eastern European case. And then there is a range in between of countries which are more or less divided on these issues. I would think maybe again of Hungary as a good example. Georgia would come to mind as a good example here. I think Armenia is also pretty much in that paradigm. So, but pretty much every country in let's say former second world would probably have would be positioned somewhere on this spectrum. Yes. And what I would like to emphasize here, something that maybe didn't come very clear at the end of my yesterday's lecture, is that I think that Subaltern Russia as a Subaltern Empire plays a key role here. As the creator of the Second World, as the Soviet Union, and then also as this intermediary which quite often tries to hijack the subjectivity of its former colonies. I mean, Ukraine is the extreme case here, with a complete denial of Ukraine's statehood, nationhood in the official Russian discourse, something that Russia claims to itself completely. Like, you can either be a pro-Russian Ukrainian, again, borscht, pampushki, and things like that. This is what defines your culture, not statehood, not high culture, not something that is valued in this classical paradigm. Or you are a Nazi. That's the choice that is offered by the Russian official discourse, right? But then also Russia claims, increasingly unsuccessfully, but still claims the role of an intermediary and a sort of representative of the post-Soviet countries, right? Now, of course, it's much more difficult. Look at Tokayev, look at Pashinyan, look at others. They increasingly take the voice. They increasingly speak in their own voice as the leaders of these countries. And there are also intellectuals who are very supportive of this, and they've been there for quite a while. There has been indeed a lot of frustration in some more nationalist intellectual circles of post-Soviet countries at their leadership's, what they see as their leadership's subservience to Russia. But unless you really look or looked into those debates, you would probably not know much about them, because they were not that vocal in international context. But still, so once again, what I would like to emphasize here is this, the worlding of this space, but also the unworlding which happened in our assessment of it. Because we see clearly the first world out there, we still see the third world, but we've lost the second world. And I think we've lost it prematurely. We need to appreciate the specificity of the post-Soviet space. Maybe not uniqueness, maybe there are other examples, similar examples, but I think it's unique at least in the sense that the Soviet project was a universalist project. It was an alternative universalist project, an alternative idea of civilization that presented itself as superior to the capitalist civilization. And this legacy is still strong. and it's still there. I love when people say that Putin is trying to rebuild the Soviet Union. That is, of course, absolutely not the case. But the idea that Russia, as the heir of the Soviet Union, has a certain special position is still there, and not only in Russia. And the idea that, you know, this whole structuring of the space is important, regardless of whether people buy into this Soviet alternative, whatever myth, or they don't buy, or they reject it explicitly. It's still structuring. And one of the examples of how this is this myth is structuring the entire space, the discursive space, but also it has, of course, material effects, in as much as we want to differentiate between the discursive and the material. This is, of course, Homo Sovieticus, again, an idea which plays a major role in how people assess the reality around themselves. And the argument that Putin is trying to rebuild the Soviet Union is part of that, of this legacy, of this myth, of this idea that there's a certain culture which has been inherited from the Soviet time, in this case. Some people would take it back to serfdom, and even before that to the Mongol conquest. Well, you know the story, right? All this mythology, which is, again, you see very clearly articulated in the Ukrainian case for good reasons, understandable, but it's a myth, and I think it's a counterproductive myth in the final analysis. Yes, these are all the arguments that you often hear, and the memes, of course. The memes. Sharikov is the favorite character in this whole story, and I think Bulgakov is personally guilty of contributing to this mythology. And then Bortko, the director of 1985, I think, film. Heart of a Dog. 88, I see from here. Yes, which, and of course Stompka and Levada, obviously, and Levada Center today, which continues to push this on us. With all due respect to the important work they do, the implications and the generalizations that they make, the implications that they draw, and the generalizations that they make, it goes far beyond any scholarly, limits of any scholarly, of what is allowed by any scholarly method, I would say. Anyway, Stompka's idea of civilizational incompetence is, of course, central here. And by the way, there is a typo there. He's Piotr Stompka, not Peter. Sorry about that. It's one of those typos that you make once, and then it goes from one presentation to another. You correct it sometimes, and then it comes back for some reason. And yes. So the idea that it's paternalist, that it's anti-elitist, and so on, whatever basis it has in the actual cultures out there, whatever evidence we might cite in support of this description is countered by an enormous amount of contrary evidence. The work, I would highlight in this context the work of Jeremy Morris in particular. I mean, there are other people like Doug Rogers, for instance, and others. But Jeremy Morris in particular I think has done great work with his field research in Kaluga, in Kaluga Oblast, looking specifically at, living with working class people in Russia, and retelling their stories and highlighting how these are stories of adjustment to a completely new reality in which they were to a large extent dispossessed, not only materially but also in terms of their status, and how they adjusted to this, and how they are trying to make their world livable and preserve their human dignity, and There are endless stories of people, trying to insist on their value. Not maybe in words that much, but in practices. Again, let's not idealize ordinary Russians. I mean, this search for dignity can also lead them to the Russian military, for instance. That's one way you can take. You are completely dispossessed. You've lost your sense of purpose. You've lost your identity as a working class, middle-aged Russian man. And then you have this opportunity to pay back your debts, to feel a hero, or at least, you think you will be feeling a hero. Whatever you feel in the battlefield, it's like, these people are, in that sense, in the social sense, they're simply dead when they come to the battlefield. Even if they survive, we don't hear them. They are like real spivaks, subaltern. They do not speak to us. They sometimes make their videos, sometimes there are people talking to them, but we know very little about what they feel out there in the battlefield. But we can probably imagine what they feel when they go there. And I think that dignity and attempt to recover dignity and status and self-respect are very important here, in addition to economic reasons. And of course, all this propaganda, mythology, and so on. But if we move on, do you recognize the woman in the picture? Ksenia Sobchak. There is a caption there. But this is a video she made in 2020 during the George Floyd protests in the US. Very strongly classist and explicitly classist, anti-leftist, anti-Marxist, but also, I think, racist. Not explicitly, but implicitly, definitely. But it's a wider picture. And I can give you a few other examples, like Mark Salonin, for instance. And again, Sobchak and Salonin, by the way, are firmly in the anti-war camp. Mark Salonin is now in Kiev, giving interviews and analyzing. And Mark Salonin is a former, I think, aviation engineer who turned into a self-proclaimed historian. Came up with a large number of publications, mostly sort of myth-making rather than actual historical work. But he is a public intellectual, respected by some. He has his own audience. He is firmly anti-war right now, but at that time he was, again, firmly sort of anti, I would say racist, simply. I mean, just to put it in plain terms. But this is also connected with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This is connected with Yellow West movement, with any working class protests in the West. I'm sure people. I haven't looked. I haven't had time. But I'm sure people are writing something like that now, in connection with the French protests. Definitely, I would expect such reaction on the part of the Russian liberals. It's a whole range of reasons why people do this, but I think mostly it's this. It's anti-Sovietism, and it's something that you see again also in the Baltic states, for instance. The idea that everything you don't like is Soviet, everything you like is the opposite. So Putin is rebuilding the Soviet Union, Movement for Black Lives is reenacting myths promoted by Soviet propaganda, and so on and so forth. Freedom of speech would be emphasized in this context, even though the same people would be in favor of restricting the freedom of speech whenever they feel comfortable about that. Look at Latvia. In Estonia, they're now also discussing a proposal to limit even news reporting and introduce fines for false reporting and so on. There is also this interesting argument that Russia is somehow immune to, well, okay, maybe no one makes it now, but back then in 2020, people actually made this argument. I heard people on Echo Moskvy making this argument, people like Yulia Latynina, and I think Benediktov himself making this argument that we've gone through the Soviet period. We know what it is. So we are telling you that this is dangerous. These are dangerous lefties who want to take you into some mess. And I think an important component of this is this fear of losing the imaginary West that drives people to cling to their myth of America. By the way, Monetochka is great at that. If you heard her song about the lullaby, America, Monetochka, the singer, it's absolutely beautiful in how she mocks, like lovingly mocks this Russian myth about America. That it was essentially the America that is there in the Russian public mind is invented by the Russians themselves, and how it is, how it is important for what Russia is. Ilya Budraitskis made this argument back in 2020 that the loss of imaginary West was an important component of the reaction to the movement for Black Lives. But also, I would add to this the neoliberal layer in the contemporary Russian culture, discourse, ideology, which is pervasive, which is an element of Putinism, but also an element of anti-Putinism. The idea of individual success, meritocracy, and also sort of a justification for the post-Soviet reforms and so on. I'll probably skip this and go to Russia being not unique, and this will be probably the last part of my presentation. I think it's in a certain sense, it's an inevitable how shall I say, inevitable element, inevitable component of fast modernization and fast social change more generally, from which some people win and some people lose, or simply when you have growing inequality in society, it is reflected in culture, because class is also a cultural concept, of course. We no longer reduce it to the economy, right? And this produces frustration on the part of some intellectuals who want to identify with their own people but cannot fully identify with them. And then you have these ideas of two nations or deep divides, peasant consciousness that poisons your true whatever mentality or whatever you may call it. But okay, let's skip Chakrabarti for the moment. Let's stay in Eastern Europe. I admire this book by Tomasz Zaritsky on the ideologies of in Eastness in Eastern Europe. I think it's a very fine work which highlights the fact that there are multiple dimensions of what you may call self-orientalization or internal orientalization, or simply class and culture intersecting and creating these myths of internal other, which are also different depending on where you are in the ideological spectrum. So, for example, intelligentsia in general, the intellectuals in Eastern Europe tend to think in terms of internal otherness. They tend to present their own people as the other, which of course is part of presenting themselves as somehow knowing the truth, as the possessors, the owners of the truth. There is an element of anti-communism in that, but not only, because there are also there are other dimensions in that. So for the right, for instance, in Poland, the other is located mostly in the northwest, because that's the workers, the more industrialized part, where also there was more collective farming, as opposed to individual farming, because these are lands taken from Germany, and therefore they created eventually collective farms there. Whereas the East is more individual farming, and that's the other for liberals. So you have these multiple dimensions of otherness. In some cases, the other is the working class, more specifically. In some other cases, it's more like the rural, peasant communities. But still, the main dimension here is, of course, the fact that intellectuals try to present their own outlook as universal, and they are obviously among the winners of the post-Soviet transition, or post-socialist transition in this case. And in order to be able to ignore the negative side effects, or maybe negative aspects of the transition, they often dismiss it by relying on the Homo Sovieticus paradigm, by simply dismissing protest voices as false consciousness. And this comes as a package. This includes also reactions to Western anti-capitalist movements, to, by the way, to people like Greta Thunberg as well. The more radical critics of the West in the West itself. And there is also an element of race in this. But again, Eastern Europe is not alone. If we go back to the previous, you will see that in India, in Bengal in this case in particular, there was also this admiration of the West, and also self-orientalization on the part of some intellectuals. In this case, it dates back to the 19th century, but you can definitely come up with similar quotes from, let's say, the Russian culture for sure, and I'm sure in other cultures at different moments in time, definitely. You will have people going through this deep feeling of alienation from their own culture, because they have already internalized the idea of civilization as Europeanness, quite often mythologized, as in this example, and you simply write and speak from this position. So let's not do this. That's my, in terms of thinking and writing, this is probably the lesson that I would like to draw from this material. And finally, this is the final point, bringing it back to some conceptual things. And I decided to highlight Chakrabarty in this case, because I think, once again, it's a great book. And his idea is that you have History 1, which is the universal history of capital. And this is what Marx writes, the universal history of capital. But in Marx's writings, you see every now and then these glimpses, these symptoms of History 2, which he sort of acknowledges but does not fully appreciate, does not fully include into his thinking. Although, actually, what Chakrabarty highlights is that even money is something that predates capital and capitalism. And money, in fact, are those elements of pre-capitalist reality which capitalism then takes, integrates into its own workings, and makes into an essential element of its own system of circulation, accumulation, and so on. History 1 produces historicism, the idea of unity of development, this teleological linear time, in which time becomes a measure of cultural distance. You are different because you are backward. Any difference is conceptualized as both cultural and temporal. And it subjugates and destroys histories too, but never completely succeeds at that. And I will leave you with this quote, which I think summarizes the idea of Chakrabarty's book very well. And this is something that I would like to invite you to reflect on. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you.